This is the Get a Life Podcast. Ex-Cult Conversations.
We have a couple special guests with us here today. First of all, we have Jill Aebi-Mytton with us. She is from the UK, and she's going to walk us through her journey and her encyclopedias of wisdom and knowledge she has stored inside her. And we also have a brand new special guest who's going to start co-hosting with us. Richard, do you want to do the honors of introducing us to your little one?
Well, everyone, this is Kiara Charlotte, and she is only 2 days old. And I don't know quite what she's going to say, but I've no doubt she'll make some contributions as we go along.
It's adorable.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah, it's what we all needed. A little bundle of innocence.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah. Okay, Jill, I'm going to pass the mic over to you. If you just kind of want to introduce yourself, and let the listeners know where you're from, your background, kind of a little bit about your story, and how you got kind of where you are today. And then we'll kind of jump around in all the different kind of little categories that we want to talk about.
Okay, how long have you got?
Well, you can come back as many times as you want. So we'll cover whatever we can cover.
After your induction, the imposter syndrome hit, because I'm not sure that I'm an encyclopedia of wisdom, but there we go.
I guarantee you are. I've had many conversations with you. You are a encyclopedia of wisdom.
Okay, so my name when I was born was not Jill Mytton. It was Elizabeth Jill Mytton, but my mother always called me Jill, so that's how I remained. And then I married a Swiss guy and got called Jill Aebi. So who am I? I don't know. I'm either Jill Aebi, Jill Mytton, Jill Aebi-Mytton. Take your pick. Or in the hospital, I'm usually Elizabeth Aebi because they can't say my surname. But there we go. I live at the now. 6 months ago, I moved into a little village about 30 miles south of London. It's very dark out there tonight because they don't have street lights, which is great. A little bit scary when you have to go out. So like all of us, I was born into the exclusive brethren a very long time ago. I didn't choose to leave. That was my parents' decision. They decided to leave when I had just had my 16th birthday.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I'd just gone into what we call the advanced level years at school, the last 2 years when we end up with advanced level certificates. So that was, and even as I'm talking about it now, I can feel my body is reacting because that was a very traumatic incident, really. Back in those days, I mean, I was brought up in the 40s and 50s, so a lot of people looking back think, oh yeah, that was before it got crazy. To some extent, this is true. However, something I came across, which I'm going to try and share, if I can. It's a quote that I used in my thesis, actually. I think it's that one. I might need to make it a bit bigger. Can you, oh, no, yes, can you see that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we see on every side wives refusing to pray with her husbands. This is from 1877. Brothers estranged from brothers, daughters leaving pious and loving parents to lead a life apart, close and happy ties of friendship and affection severed. The persons in question have been led to believe that that course of action is the path of duty and obedience to God. So that was said in 1877.
Wow.
That's a long time ago. And I think we need to remember that whilst we know all about things now, that's partly because we have the internet, we have telephones, we have newspapers all around us. Whereas, of course, back then, anything that happened was just passed around by word of mouth. And it was very much the same, actually, when I was a kid. We didn't hear very much about anyone else, any of the other localities, if you like. So while stories from people pre-1960 are not full of shock horror type stories, you know, the dreadful sexual abuse that we hear about now and so on, the thing is, we don't know what was happening. We don't know what was going on.
Yeah.
Where I lived, it was very much like the little local community, and that's all you knew. So friendships, for example, were tricky because I was the only girl. There was one other girl, but we didn't get on very well. So that was kind of a bit limiting. I think in the 40s and 50s, the whole environment in the Brethren was much more nuanced and implicit rather than explicit.
Yeah.
So we grew up not really knowing what the rules were. We had to sort of second guess them. And that kind of brought problems of its own because there was a feeling of uncertainty around. And I don't actually remember an awful lot of my childhood. I've been told by a therapist that probably it's because I was dissociated most of the time. I guess your listeners know what dissociation is.
I'm pretty sure they do.
Yeah. It stops memories from being laid down in the brain. So I only have little tiny cameos of things to think about. Some of the memories I have, they're not all bad. One memory I have is of the hall on a Sunday morning. We used to call the meeting rooms then. I'm not sure if they still are. And the sun is shining through the windows because they still had windows then. And I could hear the church bells of the church just up the road. And it was very peaceful, a very peaceful sort of feeling until the church bells stopped. And then I couldn't listen to them anymore. I had to listen to the brethren, the men talking. And their words used to kind of waft over my head like a grey mist. I had no idea what they were talking about. And interestingly, back then, as well as now, it was the men on the front row and the women and children behind. So that's steeped in history.
So that stayed, hey? That was all the way back then.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually still have a bit of a phobia of going for an interview, especially if the men are sort of sat in front of me and they're all wearing dark suits and ties, because they wore ties in those days. I still kind of slightly have a moment of freaking out. Another memory that's not such a good one is of the gospel meetings, which were every evening then. It was just one gospel meeting and the preacher would talk for 45 minutes. And the children then all sat, because the seats were all facing in the same direction, not in a circle, but all facing the same direction towards the speaker, obviously, who was up on the platform with a big lectern in front of him. And so he was above us, looking down, the children on the front row. And I just remember them kind of thundering at us, talking at us, all about hellfire and damnation. And I just remember it being quite a terrifying place to be. I remember that quite vividly. My mother, unfortunately, perhaps because of a car accident they had when I was just 2.5, you've got that image, I think, of me at that age, standing by my mother's bed. And I think she probably was traumatized by that event because she should have died, really. Somehow she managed to survive. But I think as a result, she had to keep everything in control, and that included us, particularly me for some reason. And she did very much take on board the Brethren ethos of all or nothing, saved or sinner, right? Everything is black and white. But she honestly believed she was doing the right thing. So I've never held that against her, but it did make it difficult. There is one little story I remember. She'd found a book with a child's handwriting. Somebody had written in this book. And this isn't something you do, is it? You don't write in books. Goodness me. So she recognized my writing, she claims. And I remember sitting on her knee in a stool in the bathroom for some reason. And she just kept going on and on and on at me until I sobbed and said, yes, it was me, even though I knew it wasn't me.
Oh.
So in other words, she was weaponizing guilt.
Yeah.
But I don't know, in later years, I talked with her about some of these events, and I am pretty sure that, like the rest of us, she was indoctrinated by the Brethren beliefs and practices. And because of her car accident as well, I think she was terrified of losing any of us, losing control of us, you know. So I kind of get that. But, you know, the rules, what made it so uncertain is that we never knew what we were allowed to do. You know, it was a weird situation. I'll tell you another story, if you like, about roller skates. My cousins were in the Open Brethren, one of the offshoots of the main Plymouth Brethren branch. And they were having such fun. They were rolling around on these skates all around the drive and down the paths and having to, and of course I didn't have any, so I couldn't join in. You know how I comforted myself was by saying, yes, but you see, roller skates are evil, they're wicked. We shouldn't have roller skates and have fun. So even though they're having fun and I'm not, it's okay because, you know, I've seen the light, as it were. I didn't think any more about it until I was about 30 or 40, somewhere around that time. And I said to my mother one day, why did the Brethren consider roller skates to be evil? And she said, they don't. They never did. I don't know about now, she said, but they didn't back then. So I said, well, why didn't I have any then? And she said, you didn't ask for them. So you didn't get them. But my child's brain had worked out that if I didn't have something, I didn't have it because it was evil. And that's something that it's a kind of an implicit indoctrination.
The basic indoctrination that they instill in you, right?
Yeah.
That's their ground level.
Yeah. And you don't even know it's happening. And even in later years, looking back, you don't realize what it was. I honestly still thought that roller skates, the Brethren considered roller skates to be evil.
And it's almost as if someone's enjoying something, if something's fun, then it must be evil. And you end up with this sort of complex whereby if you start enjoying yourself, you feel guilty because there must be something wrong. Yeah. Because this is supposed to be a life of suffering. So yes,
exactly. And of course they weaponize that guilt, don't they? By you know, telling you, well, you know, you need to get saved, you need to get right with God. We had all that as well. You know, that wasn't something that came in with JT Jr. It was there all along. And I had 3 mantras in my head. One was the one, don't know if I'm quoting it correctly, the one about being born in sin and shapen in iniquity. That was one of them. Yeah. So I'm rotten to the core. Another one was, well, I shall tell you how I remembered it. I remembered, ye shall be judged and found wanting. But that's not correct. The correct one is, I think thou art weighed in the balance and found wanting.
Yes.
That's how I understood it, I suppose. But then on the other side, so you've got these 2 negative ones. On the other side, you've got, well done, thou good and faithful servant. So I think as a child, like many of my generation, perhaps, we were fearful because of these messages we were getting, because of the thundering, scary preachers. They really were scary. You could almost feel them spitting at you. You know, they were so passionate about it. Against all of that is, well done, thou good and faithful servant. So, you know, it's like I spent most of my childhood trying to be that good and faithful servant so that I wouldn't be judged.
Wow, I'm blown away that this kind of heavy indoctrination was all the way back then. Like it's good to get this out and have people from all different timelines to come forward and like really give this.
Yeah, historically, it's important we understand about history. And it's important to understand how even back in the 19th century, the Brethren were actually preaching quite nasty things: hellfire, brimstone, ashes, burning hell. Those are all very graphical to a child, because to a child, those are not metaphorical, they're real.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
They're absolutely real. Whereas to an adult, they're like, yeah, that won't really happen. That's not what it means, you know,
Yeah.
or whatever, however they deal with it. And I imagine they still preach that, don't they?
Oh yeah, 100%.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it came in your priestly visits, right? It was like
Yeah.
weekly priestly
Yeah.
visits that was all thrown on you. And I do think too, Jill, you might find this, that, I mean, sometimes your interpretation, so, you know, we've got these mantras and things that you remember, and maybe they were misquoted, but do you think sometimes the priest misrepresented what they meant to be able to hold this hold of fear over top of the congregation that they're delivering it to, right?
Yeah, because things with, well, there are verses like that, mantras like that are taken out of context.
Yeah.
So you don't, and as a child, you don't know the context. You just hear these judgmental words and these messages that you are worthless and nothing that you do is of any value. That's just the Holy Spirit working through you, which is another one. So you can't even take credit for something you've done well, you know, because it's you didn't do it. The Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
I think it's very important, and that you're pointing out the damage that is done to even very young children. And what goes along with that is the other thing that you pointed up in your thesis and in your work is that the Brethren is very much a generational cult. It's not the kind of cult that people get pulled into at an adult age where they have, you know, maybe by a deceptive process, but voluntarily join. We didn't ask for this, and yet we end up passing it on to our children. And then one of the things that makes me very happy is that this child here is breaking that generational curse. I mean, I was born into it, my father was born into it, my grandfather, my great-grandfather probably. But this child is born free. She's not going to be submitted to that evil control.
She may well still have some leftovers from you because you were born into it. It's like my two daughters. I mean, they're very well aware of what I do and why I'm doing it and all the rest of it, but it has taken me away from them at times. I'm pretty sure of that. And the struggles with my mental health during the first 10 or 15 years of their life as well, you know, it was not easy for them.
Yeah, they talk about that in research, about it taking 7 generations to fully break a whole, like a complete tie of the remnants emotionally and mentally, to be completely free of them. It takes those 7 generations to completely dissolve all of that trauma through the generation.
That sounds like a lot of generations, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I guess it could take a few.
But you think of like the things that are seated in us, right? Like, I mean, I find myself many things that I've passed on to my children, right? That I don't even, you know, I can't help myself but pass on some of these fears to my children. They just change their form, right? They change how they're presented to the children, right? I mean, the biggest blessing is that they're not in that indoctrination every day. The biggest blessing, right, Richard, is that he is not inside this indoctrination 7 days a week. Right. And our job now is to be able to sit back and be able to, you know, and this is why I really wanted you on here, Jill, is like, not all our listeners know exactly where you've gone inside your work, but your research, the conversations, when I sit down and have a conversation with you, it's just so fulfilling. And I know you don't really see yourself like that because you've just lived it. But you've got this wealth of information and knowledge when it comes to mental health, when it comes to emotional regulation, that you've just gone and sought out to be able to help with all of the trauma that's left behind once you leave, because that is a huge taking on. I mean, most people stuff it away, zip it up, and pretend it never happened and try and move forward. And a lot of the ex-members that I'm in touch with now, as we're getting a bunch of things going here in Canada and having to dig up some stuff, it's hard for them. It's hard for them to go back in and unzip that, because in their mind, they're done with it. But
yeah, absolutely.
It
reminds me of World War II veterans. A lot of them didn't have PTSD at the end of the war. 50 years later, when we had some kind of commemoration here in London, a whole bunch of them developed PTSD.
Yeah.
Because for 50 years, they'd used all their coping mechanisms to keep it all at bay. Yeah, that happened then. I'm a free man now. Look what I've done for my country.
Yeah.
And I have to stiff upper lip and all the rest of it. But with the commemorations, with Vera Lynn recordings being played everywhere and the arc lights over London and the fireworks and stuff going off, an awful lot of them became extremely distressed. And of course, by then they were quite elderly people, and it becomes more difficult to face your demons, if you like, when you're older. So, and I think a lot of people, when they leave these cultic groups, they do lock it away.
Yeah.
And I know we're going to talk about PTSD in a moment, but it is actually important to think about PTSD and the symptoms. The question is, are they symptoms or are they coping mechanisms?
It's a very good, that's a very good point.
Right?
Yeah.
Perhaps we'll come to that later. There was one other thing I wanted to say about being raised in the 40s and 50s, and that was that we had to ask to break bread. And until you did, you weren't a full member, although you were treated as such. So we had to ask to break bread. So a lot of the preachings on a Sunday evening would be straight at the young people, the sort of 12, 13, 14-year-olds, putting a lot of pressure on them to ask to break bread. And that is one memory that I have, one of the few, because I remember one Sunday evening, I guess I was about 13 or 14, the pressure became too much. I got absolutely panicked inside because I thought, if I don't ask to break bread now, it's not going to happen and I'll go to hell. That was my thinking. Not, oh, yes, I want to commit my life to the Lord, but I need to ask, because if I don't, I'll go to hell. I mean, that's not a reason to ask to break bread. And I was in bed and I was crying and sobbing and just didn't know what to do. And I called my father and he came in and I said to him, I want to break bread. Can I ask to break bread? And he sort of comforted me a bit, but he told me later that he couldn't understand why I was so upset. And it bothered him that I was so upset, because he said, you should have been happy because you're committing yourself to the Lord. But you weren't happy. You were distressed and scared. But of course, because I had asked, he had to pass it on to the brethren. And that's another reason why I don't like sitting in front of a group of dark-suited gentlemen, because 3 or 4 of them came round. We didn't call them priests in those days. They were just brothers. Yeah. Brothers in the Lord. And they came round and sat down with me. My parents weren't with me. They should have been, really, because at 13, you're still a what you call it, a child, really, aren't you? Yeah. And the only question I remember from all the questions they asked me was, do you believe in the doctrine of the token?
Wow.
The obvious answer that I had to give was yes. I hadn't got a clue what they were talking about. Not a clue. Oh my gosh. You know? Do you understand the doctrine of the token, Cheryl? Do you?
I'm just shocked. Walk us through. I'm just blown away here. Walk us through how. So did you have to ask this every week, or was it just once a time?
You ask it once. Your parent then takes it to the brethren. The brethren come and see you. And then they have a care meeting to decide whether or not Jill can be, take part in the breaking of bread.
I had no clue it worked like that. That is just
that was pretty scary for a 13-year-old.
Yeah, of course it would be.
Absolutely terrifying. But, I thought, well, I have to ask. And if you talk to some of the other people of my generation, they'll tell you the similar story. But you know what really irked me? Having got over the terror and oh, I've been accepted. Oh, it's going to be my big day on Sunday. I'm going to be the new one on the block, you know.
Mm.
To my horror, the other girl that I mentioned earlier, that the only other girl in our meeting decided to do exactly the same thing. So there were two of us, and I felt that my moment of glory had been stolen, you know.
So when they asked you if you believed in the doctrine of the token, do you believe that was, do you believe in what we are doing?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I got.
I mean, the doctrine of the token was very much a thing at that time, I think. You know, this idea that women had to keep their head covered. I mean, they always did keep their head covered as far back as we know. I mean, in Victorian times, women kept their hairs covered anyway. You know, Victorian women would have worn hats or scarves or something.
I'm just shocked at the rules and indoctrination from back there. I'm like mind blown right now. But
as I said earlier, you know, it was quite implicit. We didn't know what the rules were. Yeah. We really didn't know. I mean, we kind of knew we had to go to the meetings, but we didn't go all week. But it was weird. I somehow knew that I couldn't have friends at school. Well, how did I know that? I don't know. I don't remember being explicitly told you can't have friends at school. It was just implicit. I knew that all the girls around me, it was a girls' school, were having fun. They had boyfriends that they would talk about, and they were having parties. They went to the cinema. The pop music was emerging on the scene, so they were all into that, and they were giggling over girly things in the corner of the playground. And I was just shut out from it. And I remember another little cameo. One day in the playground at school, I went up to this group of girls, and they instantly stopped talking and looked at me and said, "Go away, you wouldn't understand." So they knew there was something about me that was different.
And that sticks, right? That's hard. That's one thing that I still suffer from, is like the going to a public school and being that different kid, such a different kid. Like, I can't even imagine what you must have felt like in that moment, because there's a piece of you that just shatters.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Would it be a kind of, I mean, peer pressure would be a large part of that implicit indoctrination, would it? You're not told not to do something, but you sort of unconsciously model yourself on what everyone else is doing. Is that how it works partly?
Well, I think so. I mean, it happens to ordinary kids as well, but the kind of things that they pick up from their friends at school are not sort of rules and regulations so much as, you know, I mean, you can see the kids in my little grandson's school all doing their same thing. They've just had their nativity play, and they all sat there good and quiet because everyone else was sitting there good and quiet, you know. Whereas my grandson, I could tell what he really wanted to do was to start bopping around in the middle of the stage, but he didn't do it because no one else was, you know. He did at one point when we were all standing up, start doing this, you know, then he looked at me and he looked at his mum and he thought, I better not do this. But, you know, that's a bit different, isn't it? I think I said to somebody once that we kind of absorb things as children. Like, it's almost like a process of osmosis. It kind of goes into us. So, you know, I mean, I'm watching my grandson at the moment, who's a bit on edge because there's some uncertainty over his father's work. And you can just kind of see it in him, you know, that he's anxious. He's picking it up, even though they're not talking about it in his presence. It's just something kids do. And we do have to be very careful about that, I think. But, you know, So I think I learned in my childhood that the world was a very uncertain place. You never knew what was going to happen. You didn't know what rule was going to come next. And then there was that strange period of time between 1953 and 1959. So 6 years of sort of an interregnum period between JT Senior and JT Junior. And there was a lot of tension around in the meetings. People were sort of, do you think he's going to be the leader? Do you think he's going to be the leader? And also, I don't know whether you remember any of this. Richard, but yeah, you hadn't been born.
No.
But it was, I mean, what was his name? Coates was his surname. CAC, they always referred to him as.
Yeah.
He was potentially going to be somebody, or there was another one, I can't remember his name now. So that there was actually a mini split around 1955 that everybody forgets about. One of the families that we saw quite often left at that point. It was over the matter of worshipping of the Holy Spirit or something.
Yeah, that rings a bell. Yeah.
So, you know, I always say to people, the sort of eras, the periods within the Brethren history, they're sort of determined by the leaders almost.
Yes.
But let's get into a competition about it. They're all different. You know, they're all different. They all damage us in different ways.
Yes.
But we all end up in the same pool.
Yeah.
Everybody slides into the same pool of trauma.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's like grief. You know, sometimes you hear people saying, yeah, but she'd lived her life, hadn't she? As if that made the grief of the children left behind any easier. And it just doesn't. So these things should never be competitions, in my opinion.
Yeah. So I want you to tell the research, or tell the listeners what you ended up doing with your life.
Yeah. I'm probably now where I should have been sort of 30 years ago.
But you became a psychologist.
I did eventually, but first of all, I was an occupational therapist. I was trying to be normal, you see. By then, by the time I was 17, we'd left the Brethren. I had 2 advanced levels under my belt, which were pretty bad scores on them. And everyone else was going to university. That was the thing you did, wasn't it? That was normal. I didn't know there were thousands of people who never went to university because, you know, because I was in a public school, I didn't get to know about all the kids that couldn't even read. I just didn't know they existed. So I thought, I'll be normal, I'll go to university, then realized I couldn't. So I literally went through the careers book one day and picked out all the things where I only needed 2 rubbishy A levels. And somehow I landed on occupational therapy. So I did that and worked in a huge psychiatric hospital in the south of London. They've all gone now. They were big, massive, big institutions, awful places to work in. But I used to go through these patients' notes, and they'd go right back to the Victorian times, you know, that whole story of these people's lives. And I began to realize that all these patients who were in psychiatric hospitals had in fact had very traumatic childhoods in one way or another. And I just wanted to know more. And I thought, well, I can't go to university. And I thought, yeah, I could go to the Open University. So I started one of the modules at the Open University and was very surprised when I did rather well with it. And actually, I then discovered that I could use that in order to go to the University of Sussex, it was in the end, which was amazing. Of course, my kids, this is where one way my kids have suffered, because I was doing all this while they were at school. I was a single mum by then, you know. So it was hard, but yeah, I mean, I lived in Switzerland for 7 years too. When was that? That was after I did the training at the Occupational Therapy College, that's right. Then I went to Switzerland. Then I came back to the UK because I couldn't cope with Switzerland or my husband, and came back to the UK, worked in this psychiatric hospital, and then did that degree. And after that, I thought, well, I can't go and be a clinical psychologist now because my kids are taking their exams. So I thought, what shall I do now? And I went and did a maths qualification and became a maths teacher, because I knew there was a shortage of maths teachers.
And then on top of that,
I didn't actually get to where I should have been all along, an academic in a university, until 1995. So that was when I started getting into research and taking
that's what I wanted to talk about.
Seriously, and you know, I knew where I was going then.
Because I think that's you. I mean, your research that you've done. I mean, your thesis is incredible. The research that you've done on top of that that's, I mean, I know it created some ruckus inside the Plymouth Brethren, right? I mean, that's a whole other podcast and a whole other show. But I think that is where the whole encyclopedia that lives inside you is going to be able to help us in these next few years.
Mm-hmm. You think I'm going to be here for another few years?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, you will. Well, I told you, I said, I just need to come live there and like take care of you so that I can nurture you for the next 5 to 10 years. So that we can get
very
all
welcome. There's a spare
juicy
bedroom
wisdom
here.
out of you. But so if we get back onto this, so I have a couple slides here that I just want to, this is about like what an ex-member goes through when they leave. Let's just go through some of this.
Which one are you going to show? Right. Yes.
Okay. I'm just going to go through. It's a list. I just got to get my full screen, and I just got to go through here. Okay. Yeah. So I just like seeing things in black and white, and I know our people who watch these on YouTube like to see things in black and white. We can sit here and we can talk, but it's different when you have things in black and white in a list. Tell us a little bit about this slide.
Okay. It should be fairly obvious to most people now that when you decide to leave, or when you're kicked out, or when you're taken out, as I was, that you go through a huge experience of loss. I mean, you lose everything. You lose your family because they shun you. You lose your friends for the same reason. Quite often you lose your home if you have to leave it in order to leave the Brethren. So you might still be living with your parents or something. Most people lose their job. Yep. We know why that is, because everybody works in a Brethren company. And in a sense, you lose your entire life. You're losing everything that you ever knew. Your thoughts, your feelings, and everything. Yes. So when you leave, you get, as I've said here, this sudden void, absolute nothingness. I remember looking back on when I left and thinking it was like an earthquake. Suddenly someone had ripped everything out from under my feet. And unlike people who choose to join cults, we've got no past life to return to. We haven't got a past to return to. All our past, we call it the narrative inheritance of a family. As Richard has explained, it goes back generations. So all we've ever known is Brethrenism. The dissociation I've referred to already, and the problem with that is it gets in the way. It is a coping mechanism that the brain uses to protect us from extreme anxiety and trauma, but it becomes a habit and it gets in the way. My 2 daughters used to say, "Mum, sometimes you're just not with us. You're just not there." Yeah. One of the big problems people have when they leave is they just don't know how to be independent. They don't know what that means. They've relied on other people all their life. And they don't have the life skills anyway to live in the world. And in fact, the Brethren themselves say this in that Everyman program on the exclusive Brethren produced by the BBC. You can see those 3 brothers sitting at a table with a white sheet and everything. It was quite funny, really. But one of them, I think it was Garth Christie, actually says, you know, when people leave, they're not equipped to live in this world. They're just not. And they know this. And that's something that people who leave have to struggle with. We didn't just leave a cultic group. We left our lives, all of us.
And I think that's what's important for listeners to understand, right? Is that it's your whole life you're leaving behind. You're literally leaving a world and you have to enter a whole other world.
Exactly. And quite often you're doing it on your own. In the times of the big splits, the 1960 split and the 1970 split, a lot of people left at once. So they had the comfort of other people around them. And social support is actually very important when you're going through a stress.
Yeah.
Or trauma. But people that leave on their own. Okay, so this was the study I did in 2010 to 2012 when it was rudely interrupted by the Brethren.
Whole other podcast.
Putting it politely. I had 260, oh, it's 255 it says here. Not everybody completes all the questionnaires when you send them out. I actually had 264 participants, but obviously 9 of them chose not to do this particular scale. This scale measures the existence of interpersonal problems. So that's me talking to you, where I might have a difficulty. I might find it too hard to be assertive, or I might be too aggressive, etc. All those things along the bottom. What was absolutely amazing, when we compared the scores of the former Brethren group with the non-clinical population, I don't know whether you know this, but statistically, when you give a questionnaire like this to somebody, you have a normative population. So whoever created this, it was Barkham and Hardy, they would have sent the questionnaire out to a bunch of people who were not clinical. They were people, ordinary run-of-the-mill people, and they get their means that they would get on this scale, and that's the blue bars, right? So this is a non-clinical population that we're comparing the Brethren population with. And the important thing is that right the way across the board, the difference is significant.
It's so huge. It's such a big difference.
That is a massive difference.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that was.
And then this one was just off the charts.
Same thing, yeah, but different scales now.
Yeah.
Somatization, for anyone that's not sure what that is, that's when we complain of a stomach ache instead of saying we're deeply depressed. The Chinese do that a lot. If you want to know how a Chinese person is really feeling, it's very difficult because they somatize everything. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So you might hear, I mean, I know someone who's left recently who talks all the time about these terrible headaches he has. And yet, in spite of exhaustive investigations, there's nothing wrong with his head.
Yeah.
So across again, right the way across, they're highly significant differences.
Yeah. And I mean, look at this, even depression, right? I mean, there's so many people that is one of the biggest things that the biggest hurdle I know for myself that I had to get over with is, and a lot of my own depression was caused from grief. It's a huge amount of grief that you go through because you're living death through people who are living. It's like this living grief that you're as if they're dead, but yet they're alive. It's like ambiguous grief.
My mother used to talk about her eldest son, my brother, in that sense. She would describe him as the living dead, and it's true. Just one scale here, it's called paranoid ideation. That means you think the world's against you. Well, of course, when you've been in the Brethren, that is what you're taught to believe, isn't it? And now, of course, you've left, so now the Brethren are against you as well. So it's hardly surprising that that scale is so high. It did shock me though. And psychoticism here is really measuring strange ways of thinking, right? And what is really interesting, I mean, we're going to be checking this again, hopefully next year, but people have always said, it wasn't so hard back then. But actually, when I looked at how old people were at the age of leaving or which decade they grew up in, there was hardly any difference between people that left recently and people like me who left, I don't know, 40, 50, 60
I believe
years.
that. I really believe that.
Interesting.
Because we all, I mean, that's what people always say to me, Cheryl, my story wasn't like yours. And I'm like, you know what? It doesn't matter. Like for me, I mean, what I went through was normal to me because I was introduced to it so early on, right? Yeah. Like we all slide into the same pool of these symptoms, no matter what your story was, how you left, what area you're in, we all still went through every single one of all of these traumas that we all talk about.
Yeah, exactly.
There's just no separation in it.
No.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's just talk a little bit about PTSD. So from your own personal opinion, do you think a lot of most ex-members suffer from PTSD?
I do. Yeah, I do. We used the Davidson trauma scale in that study. And again, like with the other two scales, there was a significant difference between the general population and the former brethren sample. It was quite significant. And in a previous study that I'd done in 90, around then, I didn't know very much about PTSD in those days, but I'd created a questionnaire made up of things people had said to me. And a lot of them were things like, sometimes I can't stop thinking about the brethren, and I get all hot round the collar, those sorts of statements. And of course, they were what they were expressing was their trauma.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's what they were talking about. And I can't bear it when I'm in the presence of something that reminds me of them, that sort of avoidance type symptom. So, no, it's very clear to me. I can't just recall what the percentage was, but it was very high. It was extraordinarily high. I don't know whether I've got it here.
And so one of the biggest things that I'm getting as we're compiling a bunch of things, and I mean, obviously a lot of people will reach out to us from doing the podcast. So there's this, obviously it's disassociation of not wanting to look back at the past. But then there's these other people who are in therapy, and the same sense statement comes over and over in my inbox of, I'm in therapy, but I feel my therapist doesn't understand me. Cheryl, what have you tried? What can I do? Where do we go from here? Is there somebody out there that can help us with our trauma? Because it is such a complex trauma. And I think a lot of people, when they dive into therapy and they've tried a couple therapists and they don't feel this connection, they don't feel like they're getting their help they need. Guess what? They put the monkey back in the cage. I mean, I did this many times. They put the monkey back in the cage, they zip it up, be like, yeah, no, I can't go there. This is my life. I left. I'm free. Let's go on. Right? Like, what would you say to people who are in these boats of A, really wanting to disassociate from what happened, and B, those people who just can't find the right therapy?
Well, as regards to dissociating from what happened or avoiding symptoms and avoiding places, that remind them of what happened, I would say if it's a coping mechanism. I have problems with the PTSD diagnosis for this reason. Because if you have a headache, the doctor will look to see what's causing the headache.
Yeah.
They don't focus on the headaches. They might give you symptomatic treatment by saying take an aspirin or a paracetamol or something. But they are keen to know what the cause is. The cause of the dissociation is the trauma that people went through.
Yeah.
And actually dissociation, avoidance, hypervigilance, startle response, sort of what's happening, being very alert to things, that's your mind trying to cope with a realization that the world is not a safe place. And they're all coping mechanisms that we use to protect ourselves. So, the first times, for example, that James asked me to appear on the podcast, I went, danger. I could almost feel my brain going, danger, danger, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I thought, no, not this time. I need to figure out what that's all about first. But our brains are amazing organs. We're faced with these threats and these difficulties. And what do? Our brain says, I can't deal with this one, so I'm going to shut down for a bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if it's really, really bad, you shut down completely. I had recently someone contact me whose wife has shut down so completely, she can't even talk to anybody. She just sits in a huddled state. She wasn't in the brethren, she was in another group. But she's clearly so traumatized that she can't cope with it at all. And the mistake her therapist made, I think, because she did begin to emerge, was she pushed it too much.
Yeah.
You have to be very careful. First of all, you need a kind of person-centered approach so that the person who's been traumatized, and in particular at the moment, since we're talking about former brethren, that they don't trust anyone anymore, and yet they trust too much. It's a kind of an odd paradox.
Yeah.
But that therapeutic relationship, before any work is done, has to be one where the person feels safe, where they feel they can trust their therapist. And if people are saying to you, my therapist doesn't understand, get out. It's not going to work.
Yeah.
Because that therapist has to understand. And if they don't understand, they need to say to the client, I'm really sorry, but I can't help you because I cannot understand your experience. I need to go away and do some studying myself and some retraining, or I need to find myself a clinical supervisor who can help me understand your world, because it's outside of my experience. That's what the therapist should say. A lot of therapists don't understand. I mean, I went through 3 or 4 therapists before I found the right one. I tried a person-centered therapist, but he was more interested on his dog that was sitting on the floor than in what happened to me. And his first question to me, as you'll see at the beginning of my thesis, was so what do the brethren believe? I didn't know. At the age of 40-something, I couldn't talk about what the brethren believed in. You don't say to an anorexic, so what's anorexia then?
Yeah.
You know, there's a complete mismatch somewhere. I mean, I'm hoping that things are gradually improving, but until the client feels safe and nurtured, I want to say, by that therapist, no therapist is going to get anywhere near being able to help them.
And I think they need to feel seen, right?
Yeah.
And
heard.
Yeah, right. That is the biggest thing. Like, I have a new therapist right now that I've started just recently, and she's just incredible with how she sees me. And she's still learning about the brethren as we go along, but her whole presence is about seeing you and validating you. And there's just this safe space you can slide into. I've never experienced therapy like it before. And obviously everything comes at the right time, right? And so she came into my life when I needed it. But and that's kind of what I have said to people, is that it's super important to try different therapists, to try different even therapies, right? And see what works for you. Right. I personally know I would not be where I am today without my therapy. There's just no way I would be where, right? Like, I think therapy is so important.
It is.
That this isn't going away, that you can stick that monkey back in its cage as many times as you want, but it's still there. I had someone who, as we were collecting stuff for the things that we're doing in Canada, I don't know how much we're supposed to say, but anyhow, we're doing some stuff in Canada and we're collecting people's information. And someone who he wasn't really hesitant on it, but he messaged me after, and he said that felt so good to write that all down. And I'm like, it does. I said, we become so accustomed to carrying this weight. And even though we got our freedom, there still is this importance of turning around and dealing with the trauma we went through, the life we had to leave behind. And I'm not saying doing it right after you leave. Go and experiment and get out there. But at some point in time in your life, you got to look in that rear view mirror, and you've got to look at all those pieces of yourself that are crying, that are fearful, that are grieving, that are so disassociated that they keep teaching you to push forward instead of just sitting down and letting everything out.
Exactly.
You gotta let it out.
Empowerment as well, isn't it? About empowerment. Because I think sometimes therapists are trained to do an assessment.
Yeah.
And to them, that means asking a lot of questions. But a lot of people who've left the brethren don't want a lot of questions. They don't want probing questions to find out, so where were you born? Where were you, what are your parents like? What was your relationship with them? And all these sorts of questions that we can get hammered with by the medical profession, which is why I say person-centered, because a person-centered therapist won't do that. They'll sit down with you and they'll wait for you to talk. They'll help you to explore. That doesn't mean that the whole approach is person-centered, but person-centered, particularly at the beginning, until that trust and safety it develops, and until the person feels heard, understood, seen, as you said, unconditionally accepted, and And the therapist mustn't move too fast. The speed has to come from the person who's been traumatized. Has to.
And that therapist that I'm going to now, that she's slowed everything right down, right? Yeah. And I cannot believe the amount of transformation that happens within me on every level because we've slowed down so much. You know, there's many ex-members, particularly the men and people that left, boys that left when they were teens, that when they turn around and go to look at this, it's just this extreme rage. And I mean, a lot of that is like, well, I can't open that up. It makes me way too angry. I don't know what to do with this rage. I don't know what to do with this anger. And I find that in the people that I'm talking to, that is a very huge symptom amongst the men. Yeah. Just this extreme rage.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, there's so many different aspects of our experiences that need exploring. You spoke a little while back of grief. You know, therapist needs to think about that as well. Is this person grieving at the moment? If they're grieving at the moment, then perhaps they shouldn't really work on their traumas right now, but it's the patient, the client, whatever you want to call them, that has to take that lead, because there is grief, there is the trauma. Even if there's, you see, what a lot of people don't understand is that you don't have to have a specific trauma to be affected. You know, that's where the complex PTSDs come from. The complex PTSD as a diagnosis uses the PTSD triad, as they call it, the three main symptoms, but it adds the dysregulation of emotion, the fact that we struggle with our feelings, the fact that this young boy gets so angry that he doesn't know what to do with himself. You know, or another young man draws the knife on the person that's looking after him. Why? Because he just doesn't know what else to do, because there's, you know, he doesn't know where to go with those feelings. And I think that's the difference. That's the difference between the two types of PTSD. But they're coping mechanisms. A lot of the symptoms are coping mechanisms. And that's one thing that a therapist also needs to understand. Because if I said to you, oh, Cheryl, you avoid going to church because it triggers you. Well, I think you should go to church. I think you should go and stand in the doorway of that church and wait until your anxiety calms down. What am I doing? That's what people do. And it works if you've had a car accident. So it's one episode, one incident, but it doesn't work when it's a coping mechanism that has kept you safe for years, kept me safe for years. I couldn't go near a church. Couldn't even talk about whether I was a Christian or not. And believe me, lots of ex-brethren always want to ask me that question. I can cope with it now, but there was a time when that question would completely freak me out because I couldn't go there. It was too dangerous for my brain and it was protecting itself.
And I think one thing that's really makes it very, very difficult for ex-brethren to go into therapy is that most ex-brethren would have had very traumatic experience of visits from priests in which they were questioned in very much the same way as a therapist would question them. And then, of course, they were betrayed, they were let down, the things they confided were spread around, and just sort of sitting in a chair and trying to be vulnerable and speak about your feelings with someone brings all that back. It's like a priestly visit. Absolutely.
And all the confessions that Craig spoke about the other day on his podcast, you know, the fact that you sat there and you were pushed into making, of course, we didn't have that, right? But certainly when that came in, that was another very, very difficult situation and does make it difficult for people to talk to their therapist. I agree.
And I think too, going through everything, that grief doesn't always just show itself as in tears and crying and heartache. Grief shows itself in so many ways. And I know of my own personal experiences that often my anger and rage is its guard to grief, right? And so I think it's important for ex-members and leavers to really understand that when you're dealing with these heightened emotions, that if you were just to sit, I guarantee you that grief is trying to find its way out. The separation that we go through, and that's what I was telling you, Jill, is like, it doesn't, like, just just somebody leaving that's had even say no trauma inside the church, and just has to make this choice to leave. That leaving from one world to another world, and the grief that happens inside on that bridge from one world to another is enough to shatter. And I mean, PTSD just comes from that one transition. And so I think it's important for everybody to understand that we all suffer just from leaving the church and coming to the outside world. That
however you left.
Yeah, like it's such a huge trauma to have to let go of your entire way of being, your life. And I mean, there's even nowadays where they're signing contracts that if you leave, that business stays with the brethren.
Yeah, right? I know.
Yeah. Like it's, they take everything, and then you've got to come out with what's on your back and try and navigate your world. Like, I do think for me, I find any kind of grief workshop that comes up, I take it, because I'm always wanting tools on how to recognize how my grief shows itself. Because it is, I'm always wanting to unwind this pattern of tension. I'm ready to unwind this. I'm doing it this life. I'm getting this unwound. So I think it's important for leavers to recognize that if it's anger and it is this rage, do you think it's safe to say, Jill, that sometimes it is grief that presents itself through that rage and anger?
Yes, I do think that. And of course, there is such a thing as righteous anger. Hate to say that word, but there is.
Absolutely.
It's not necessarily an irrational anger.
No.
That, whoever led whatever, or whoever led to that person leaving, kind of instigated this massive loss that person's experienced. For me, a lot of it is about normalizing someone's situation, not saying it's normal, but normalizing, saying that it was like Viktor Frankl, when he left the concentration camps, said that, an abnormal reaction to an abnormal event is actually a normal reaction, right? Yeah. If you left the Holocaust, those concentration camps, and just thought, oh, well, that's that done, and went off into the sunset, that would be an abnormal reaction because of what you've been through. And it's the same here. You would expect anger. You would expect distress.
Exactly.
And I think one of the reasons why people are reaching out to you and to me and to others is because those that are inside are actually looking for what the theorists would call a transitional attachment, somebody they can just hold on, that provides that bridge between the two worlds, makes it just that little bit easier. Right? I mean, all the participants in my qualitative research, the thesis, they all found attachments, transitional attachments. Because don't forget that it's not just your natural family you're leaving. You're leaving the cultic group family, which kind of is wrapped around your family.
It's a one person, right? It's this entity.
It's one family.
Yeah.
And it's this family you've been taught is more important than your biological family, right?
Yeah. Yes.
So when you leave, it's gone, shattered. What do I do? I'm all on my own now. I've got nobody to hold on to. So that's why I think they reach out.
And I think it's important that we have a landing pad for them out here. And I think that's like one of the biggest passions of mine that I have now, is to make sure that there's this landing pad, make sure that there's these tools for those that are wanting to transition out. I mean, unfortunately, I wish the judicial system was behind us in the matter of like a family wanting to leave and he can't leave because he doesn't want to lose his business, and him pleading with me, be like, hey, like, don't take your foot off the gas. We need to see this through. I know this is hard on you, but it's harder for us trapped in here. We need to make a way for us. I want to leave, but I want to leave with my family intact, my business intact. And until that happens, I can't leave. And so I think it's important for our listeners to realize why we're so vocal, why we get into some of these very deep conversations, is because the more of us that band together and create this movement that opens up the government's eyes, that opens up the judicial system's holes that they have, to be able to really help these people that are trapped in there. These are families. These aren't just disgruntled teenagers that are wanting to rebel. These are like families that realize that this is a cult.
Yeah. That's right. I mean, the government here has tried way back in 1970 something with the Gresham Cook Family Preservation Bill. You know about that, Richard?
Yeah.
My father got involved with that. Of course, this was some time after we'd left, and he got involved with that. But sadly, it didn't pass the second reading. So the government, it's very difficult to get governments to listen.
Yes.
Yeah.
Especially when, in this case, the brethren lobby them so much.
Yeah.
You know, and I better not say it, but you can guess what. You know, I mean, financially, I'll just drop that word in.
Yeah, right. It is. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we always ask our guests this. So I have to ask you, what do you think is the biggest downfall of the brethren?
Am I only allowed one?
Oh no. You can give us your top 20.
I think from our perspective, the biggest downfall is the fact that they won't talk to us. Right? They head straight for the lawyers. Whenever there's something they don't like, they go straight to the lawyers. And I said to my brother once, why don't you just talk to me? Why don't the brethren talk to me instead of going to the lawyers? It would be a lot cheaper, and we might find a way, you know, we might be able to negotiate a compromise. But then, of course, that takes you back to what's underlying it all. It's this doctrine of separation, isn't it? It's been there from the very, very beginning. You know, John Nelson Darby, in spite of all the things that he said, believed in this doctrine of separation, which initially was ecclesiastical. It was about churches, but it very quickly became more of an interpersonal kind of separation that we all know and hate.
Yeah. That's so true. It's so true. So, and one of the last questions that we ask is, if you had your chance to go back to the PBCC and they actually were going to listen to Jill, what would you say to them?
You mean if they let me back in?
Yeah. If you got to address and they were like, you know what, we want to hear from you, Jill.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
I would talk to them about all the kinds of stuff that we've been talking about this evening. I would ask them, do you actually understand how distressing everybody feels when they leave your group? That's not how it should be. You claim you're a mainstream church, but if you leave a mainstream church, you just walk out the door. You don't get shunned by everybody, or your family and your friends. You don't lose your business. You just walk out the door. It's just easy.
They don't even hire private investigators to follow you, do they, generally?
No, they don't. No, exactly. I mean, oh dear, yeah.
You know what? I'm just putting this on every podcast I do now. I want to talk to Bruce Hales. I want to talk to Bruce Hales. Is sit down and have a conversation. Exactly what you're talking about, Jill. Is sit down. Let's talk. Is there some way to repair this? Right? Yeah. He can go in there and he can change all of these rules inside there. But the past still is right here in the now. That's what this is, the past still following up behind him, saying like, we need to clean this up. It's out here. It's still hurting. It's still bleeding.
If they don't clean up their act soon, it's possible, I guess, that other people will. And I'm talking about what we were saying a moment ago, governments and lawkeepers, you know, that they won't be allowed to go on doing what they're doing.
No, I agree. Yeah.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah,
they're just pushing the envelope, seeing how far they can go. I mean, they, you know, up till relatively recently, they've generally stayed within the boundaries of the letter of the law, but now they're going way beyond that. They're going right into criminality, and they're just seeing how much they can get away with. You know, the balloon's going to burst.
Which is going to be difficult for those people who are still there.
Yeah. Was there anything else you wanted to share with us, Jill?
We could probably talk for another 6 hours, couldn't we?
You could.
It looks like you've got a library behind you, Jill.
I know. That's what I said. It's all of her knowledge.
That's why I need a high ceiling, so that my thoughts can waft upwards.
Well, we're very appreciative of you coming on and taking the time to come on. I know it's getting later on in the evening there for you. And you are welcome on anytime. I'm sure we'll have you multiple times on and dive into different things. And I know you're wanting to get back into your research again, right?
Yeah, I'm wanting to get back into my research, but I am very keen to talk further also about this whole therapy side of things, and you know, because I want to hear from people, what other people, you know, what's benefited you, what's helped.
And I agree.
And what hasn't helped.
Yeah, I do.
Because there's very little research out there about the impact of therapy.
And so maybe that's what we need to do, is just kind of put that out to the listeners. Like, if you've had a successful therapy work for you, can you message us, email us, and we'll bring Jill back on. And I did want to get into that, but I'd like to designate a whole hour to therapies. Yeah, absolutely. I think we need to go through, right, the TIR, the SE, all the different types of therapies that can help. So if we kind of just put it out there for the listeners, that if you've got a type of therapy that's worked for you, email us, let us do some research, and we'll come back with a list of how those people who have gotten through a good chunk of their trauma, how did you do it? And then we can share it with everybody, because I know that's one of the biggest questions I get. Cheryl, what therapist do you use? What therapy do you use? Mine's not working. And so I do think that deserves its own podcast on its own. So we'll bring you back for that, Jill, if you're willing to come on. And
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it would be an exploratory one more, because I mean, I talk from my own experience. I can talk from what the books say, but it's really what the listeners.
It's definitely, it is like, and I know it's worked for me. And I mean, I know there were certain therapies that you had suggested that I now have a friend that got certified in it, and she's having extreme success with her investigation into it. And so, I think it deserves its own podcast, and we'll definitely have you back on, and we'll discuss all the different therapies. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Jill, for coming on and blessing us with your beautiful brain and soul and spirit. And I could sit and talk to you for hours. I love talking to you.
Yeah.
I think I've given up one thing. I no longer think I'm worthless.
Good. You are very much, we need you, and this movement needs you. You've been doing this, Jill. I mean, what we're doing now, you started how many years ago? Right?
Yeah. We're standing on your shoulders, Jill.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, I remember contacting you over 20 years ago. And I mean, you might not remember that. You don't remember it, but I remember it. And you're a pivotal root for us to grow on top of, right?
Well,
and
I hope you start growing soon.
I do.
I mean, right back at you, because I'm just gobsmacked with the way that this has mushroomed this year, and how great you four. Where's the fourth one?
Lane's not with us today, but yes, Lane's with us.
How things have grown this year. It's been astounding, you know.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And we're grateful for the people that are inside still, that reach out to us and give us their messages and their words of encouragement. They are very much needed. There are days when, you know, we want to take our foot off the gas and just breathe a little bit. And then we get those messages and emails from those inside, and it gets my foot right back on the gas. And be like, that's what we're doing this for. That's what we're doing this for.
I understand that. Yeah.
Anyhow. Okay. Thank you so much, Jill. Take care, everyone. And we'll have Jill back on again for part 2.
To share your story or be a guest on the show, email info.getalife@proton.me.